for the workshop is, and also what the process to produce the report was. So quickly about IPBES. IPBES is an intergovernmental body. It has 137 governments as members, and the mission of IPBES is to strengthen the science policy interface for better policy through based on robust science. So IPBES does so mainly by producing assessment reports which review available knowledge on biodiversity and ecosystem services. IPBES takes an integrative approach to these issues. It looks at status and trends of biodiversity, but it also looks at the direct and the indirect causes for the trends observed. It also looks at the impact of these trends on the contributions that people derive from nature, as well as on the quality of life of people. And finally, and importantly, IPBES also looks at options for action. IPBES has produced so far 8 such assessment reports, with the last one being the global assessment of biodiversity and ecosystem services last year. Together, these reports have really built a strong knowledge base for decision making, and they've also raised the level of global awareness about the biodiversity around the world. So what is the context for holding the workshop? So the IPBES plenary last year approved a new work program for IPBES up to 2030, and in particular a new topic which is about how to simultaneously reach sustainable development goals related to health, food, water, climate change, and biodiversity, looking at synergies, looking at trade-offs, using a nexus approach, so focusing on interlinkages. This assessment would be finished approximately on the 2025 horizon. Now, in order to help scope for this future assessment, put together some ideas, some questions to be addressed, and in light of the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic, the Bureau of IPBES and its multidisciplinary expert panel decided back in April of this year to have a workshop that would be focused on biodiversity and pandemic. So experts were asked to look in particular on how infectious diseases emerge from nature and become pandemics. And they were also asked to look into the options we have to control and also prevent pandemics by better understanding the ecology of microbes, and also by acting possibly on these microbes, on these pathogens, before they emerge from the environment as diseases upon humans. So what process was followed to produce this report? So experts were selected in response to a call for nominations, and governments and organizations nominated experts, and the multidisciplinary expert panel of IPBES made the selection. The experts met virtually in July and many times thereafter to produce the report. And the report was subjected to several rounds of internal review first, and then to one external peer review. Now, one important point to note is that this report that we are releasing today is a workshop report. It is not an assessment report. One key difference is that this workshop report was not approved by governments at plenary. This workshop report also has not followed the formal IPBES review process that multi-year IPBES assessments would go through. It is a much quicker and lighter exercise to produce a scientifically robust report in a short period of time. And as you will have seen, the workshop report is substantiated by close to 700 journal articles, scientific articles, with about a third of these dated only 2019 and 2020. So very recent scientific literature substantiating this report. So that's it for me to really give you a sense of IPBES, of the context for the workshop, and also a little bit of a sense of what the process was that was followed and that led us to the report, which we're now going to hear about. So over to you, Rob, and thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Anne. Before we continue, I would like to please remind the media who are joining on this call to submit questions for any of the panelists via the Zoom webinar question function. But when you're doing that, could you please make sure you specify both your name and the outlet, your media outlet as well. A reminder that you can also follow this issue on social media using the hashtag #pandemicsreport. And please do tag @IPBES, that's @IPBES in your posts. With that, I'm now very pleased to ask Dr. Peter Daszak, Chair of the IPBES Workshop on Biodiversity and Pandemics, to share with us some of the main findings and the messages of the report. Peter, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Rob, and a real pleasure to be here. I'm going to show some slides. Give me a thumbs up if you can see those slides. Excellent. Okay, my name is Peter Daszak. I'm the president of EcoHealth Alliance. I'm very strongly focused in my career on the origins of pandemics and trying to understand them better and use every possible tool to identify how we can better deal with the pandemic threats. And what we did, I think, that's really interesting is in this workshop is put together experts from around the world, from diversity of disciplines and origins and influences on this big question. Why did COVID-19 emerge? What could we have done better? And are we going to see more in the future? And if so, how are we going to deal with this? And deal with this in a way that allows for a more sustainable planet. You know, one of the key messages is, from this report, you'll see, you know, we believe that there is strong scientific evidence that we understand the process of pandemic emergence, but it's not going to be straightforward to reduce pandemic risk in the future. It's not as simple as, you know, we just need more money to work on vaccines. This is a fundamental systemic problem as we have unsustainable economic growth around the world. And this is a product of that unsustainable economic growth. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that, about some of the evidence behind it. And 1 second while I, as is often the case, turn off my other phone. Okay, apologies. So what we found out, the science is really clear on this. Most emerging diseases, about 70%, and almost every known pandemic are caused by zoonotic pathogens, pathogens that have their origins in animals, non-human animals, that got into people by some process. And, you know, good examples of emerging diseases like this are Ebola and Zika, SARS, which has a bat origin, pandemics, influenza. Almost every influenza pandemic has viruses that have genetic elements derived from wild birds and domestic animals, pigs, quite often, that get into people. And COVID-19 is one of this pandemic group. It looks clearly from the scientific literature to be a bat origin virus. All its close relatives are from bats, and somehow it got into the human population. And that's what we looked into. And the causes of why these viruses and other pathogens cause outbreaks seem to be rooted in the same drivers that cause biodiversity loss and climate change. And that's why we're dealing with this from a biodiversity point of view. Microbes are part of natural biodiversity. The microbes that wildlife carry are part of their biodiversity. And the drivers of biodiversity loss, climate change, drive their emergence into people, especially land use change. And we're talking about deforestation, urbanization, changing forests around the world, degrading forests, agricultural expansion, just the volume of livestock and cropland produced every year is increasing, and that drives disease risk, and intensifying production drives disease risk. And we've looked at all the evidence for that and laid it out in the report from peer-reviewed literature. And clearly wildlife trade and consumption, in particular overconsumption, it seems, of wildlife for various products, both directly as food, but also for animal products like fur and leather, the pet trade, have driven outbreaks. And there's very little surveillance on this. And there's, we think, a sort of lack of understanding of the volume of wildlife trade globally from the public's point of view. It's clearly pandemic risk is part of that. You know, the biodiversity side of this is very interesting. There are estimates out there of how many undiscovered viruses there are in wildlife. Ecoth Alliance put out one estimate of about 1.7 million, about 540 to 850,000 of which, and that's just in mammals and water birds, could infect people. You know, so it's quite interesting that we don't know this diversity. We know about 2,000+ viruses that have been discovered. Yet we keep seeing these new viruses emerging and causing diseases in people. So why aren't we going out there and treating this as a form of diversity that we really need to understand? And that gets to this strong message from the report that there are ways to identify and deal with these threats before they become pandemic. Our current strategy to deal with pandemics is to really wait for them to emerge and try and identify them as soon as possible in the early stages of emergence before they spread. And that's what happened in China in the Huanan seafood market with COVID-19. The Chinese authorities were on the case quickly. They knew there was a new disease there. They worked out what it was, and they tried to contain it, but it was too late, and it spread globally. And here we are waiting for a vaccine and drugs to work. It's not a good strategy. We need to do more. So we propose a few key mechanisms to, the IPBES report puts forward policy options from the science. These are not direct calls from IPBES to do this, but they're suggestions for what could be done. One of them is an intergovernmental high-level council or panel on pandemic prevention. So this transformative shift from waiting for pandemics to emerge and deal with them in a reactive sense to control them, to actually trying to prevent them by dealing with the underlying drivers of land use change, climate change, and the wildlife trade. So look at the details in the report. A coordinating body that will bring together information about risk and try and identify funders and strategies to deal with it. A fundamental One Health approach, One Health being the linkage between human health, animal health, and the environment within which all these things operate. COVID is a beautiful example of that, and a very frightening example of that at the same time. A clear link between animals and people, and a clear link to environmental change in Southeast Asia, through land use change and continued encroachment into wildlife habitat and the wildlife trade. One Health could be used better to prevent pandemics, to build better preparedness for pandemics, and to enhance outbreak control. And we need mechanisms to do that. And that's in the report. And really importantly, look at the consumption patterns that drive all of this. And I think this is where there's some real optimism here. This is not a doom and gloom report saying the world's going to end and it's too late. This is an optimistic call for action. We can all get engaged in this. We can all do our bit to reduce pandemic risk in the future. The consumption patterns that drive global livestock production, deforestation, are often driven by us. Increasing dependence on meat as part of our food, dependence on the fur trade that involves animals bred in different parts of the world that can carry coronaviruses, for instance. These things need to be appreciated by the public and worked on to reduce those consumption trends. And then a strong underlying message that business as usual is not going to be enough. So business as usual for COVID and for all pandemics is hoping for a vaccine and a therapeutic, which we are still waiting for right now. And I'm here in lockdown, as many others are. The US is going into a significant wave of problems, as are many countries in Europe and elsewhere. 44 million cases, over 1 million deaths, and they're the ones we know about. Looking at excess mortality rates, the actual death count is a lot higher than that. COVID has revealed gaping inequalities in healthcare, even within the richest countries on the planet, that lead to more death in minorities and underprivileged groups. It's shown how susceptible indigenous peoples and local communities are around the world to the lack of provision of healthcare in the face of a global pandemic. And it's cost us lives and money, trillions of dollars. The estimates aren't fully clear yet on how expensive COVID-19 is going to be, but it follows a trend that we've seen over the past few years of an increasing economic impact from these pandemics. And this is the economic case for prevention here. If a pandemic costs billions of dollars, yet preventing pandemics costs less, why aren't we doing that work? Why aren't we using that to get a better return on investment for our programs? And you can see the big dark shadow there of COVID-19. The estimates are getting better every day. We've heard recently of just the US alone of a cost of $16 trillion by autumn next year when a vaccine comes online. COVID-19 is likely to cost tens of trillions of dollars to the global economy. Yet the strategies to control pandemics by dealing with the underlying drivers are going to cost tens of billions of dollars. So this is the transformative change we're hoping that this report will lead to. And we're hoping that the scientific community, the public health community, the conservation community, policymakers and the public are going to get on board and look at what we've said in an honest interpretation of what the science is telling us, a call for action. $1 trillion of annual economic damages from pandemics and other emerging zoonotic diseases. And that's an estimate that may be an underestimate. Global strategies to prevent them in the order of $40 to $58 billion, 2 orders of magnitude return on investment. You put $1 into prevention, you get $100 return in the future. Why aren't we doing this on a global scale? And of course, the answer is it's always difficult to build these prevention programs and hope we can control things. So we're hoping that this will be a transformative shift in the way we approach pandemics and the way policymakers get on board with an ounce of prevention is worth 100 pounds of cure. So I'm going to hand back to Rob and then look forward to questions coming to all of our experts around the room and look forward to helping in any way to get this information out to the people who matter. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Peter. And just another big word of appreciation to you and to all of our authors for the massive amount of work and time that's been invested into getting the report to this point and producing it in such record time as well. Much appreciated. Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to just mention we did have a bit of a challenge with the YouTube feed, and I would like to recognize everybody who is on YouTube and has been able to rejoin through the new link. We're very pleased to have you with us. I also note a question from the YouTube link about where this report is available, and that was from one of our social media engagers, Klaus Rieder. The report and all documentation is available on the IPBES website, www.ipbes.net/pandemics. That's the report itself, the media release, and the executive summary. So there's now going to be an opportunity for questions from the media. We have just about 35 minutes of time left for questions. Please make sure that you use the Q&A function, the question and answer function, if you're a member of the media on this webinar that we're busy with, rather than the in-channel chat function. And what we'll then do is ask you to please also identify which outlet you're from, as well as your name in writing. So I'm going to read out some of the questions that we've been receiving, and I'm going to ask Anne and Peter to either field those personally or for Peter to decide which of the other 6 panelists who are on with us on the panel would perhaps be better placed to answer these questions. So turning to the first media question which we have, this comes from Urmi Goswami from Economic Times. The question is, what recovery measures would you recommend to the leaders of nations which have been worse hit by the double whammy of COVID and economic fallout? Some of these economies in the global south are already overburdened by extreme poverty, inequality, and inequity. What future course correction is missing in current political decisions in such countries and should be focused on? So Peter, would you like to take that question?
Well, I'll start off and then I want to hand over to John Amwasi, who is working with the government of Ghana to advise them on how to deal with these issues.
I'm not sure John has joined us yet. I think he may not be actually with us today.
I see him. So look, you're absolutely right. This is a key issue for all countries. Look, the economic impact is enormous, in part because of the social distancing measures we have to use to control an outbreak in the absence of vaccines. As we build back from this pandemic, the message in the report is that there are 2 ways to build back. One is to go back to our business as usual and just continue the overconsumption and exploitation of the planet's resources that will lead to more pandemics. We see a continued rise over time in pandemic threats coming from emerging diseases. The science tells us there are going to be 5 new emerging disease events every year. That's been known for almost 2 decades now, from a paper from Kate Jones et al. In 2008. And yet we continue our business as usual. So we're hoping for transformative change in consumption patterns, a green recovery, rather than just going back to the way things were that drove this pandemic. Easy to say, really difficult to do. And I'm going to hand over to John, because you can tell us, John Amwasi, about what it's like in countries like Ghana as they try to recover from COVID.
No, thank you very much, Peter, and thanks for that presentation and for the question. I think it's a really critical question that has been asked, and especially for countries in the global south, or what has been referred to as low middle income countries. This is really a unique opportunity to press the reset button, or to do things using a slightly different paradigm, especially since we may not be so far advanced in the really overconsumption, destructive approach towards food production and consumption. There have been many efforts to use indigenous and more conservative approaches to providing food security in countries, to allow for better collaboration among countries in the subcontinent, particularly in Africa, in order to assure food security. And in these COVID days, we saw the difficulty that there was for many countries in pursuing the usual approach of importation of products, especially food and food products, which otherwise could be produced in country in a more sustainable way, or could have been sourced more efficiently from within the continent itself. So I see this report as one which would find its way to the tables of the African Union, to the tables of the various regional intergovernmental groups within the continent and beyond, and allow for very high level decision making, especially within the economic blocks, which would lead to a different way of doing things. And this is very possible because a lot of the structures which will eventually lead us to the overconsumption and destructive patterns that we see predominantly in the West are very nascent. And so we can kill them easily and start off on the right footing.
Great, thank you very much. I just wanted to say I omitted to introduce John Amwasi from Ghana in the beginning of the call. Thank you very much, John and Peter, for that answer. I'm going to turn to some of our next questions now. We have a question from Annika de Greus of Swedish Radio, who asks, if there are 1.7 million undiscovered viruses, how can you know that number if they're undiscovered? I'm going to ask a second question, Peter, for the sake of just sort of efficiency. A question from Tetsuji Ida from Kyoto News to Peter. Can you describe risk relating to exotic pets and their global trade? So a question about the number on 1.7 million undiscovered viruses and the exotic pet and global trade. Peter?
Right. The issue on the exotic pet trade, I'll hand over to Thijs Kuken, who has all the information on that. I think you know, the number of undiscovered viruses is important. This is an estimate, and we know it's not entirely. We can't know for sure how many unknown. The way it was calculated was by looking at discovery rates. If you do continued sampling of species and discover viruses in them and sample in the same way over time, you start to discover more and more, and you find the same viruses popping up, and the rate of discovery starts to level off. Ultimately, you will discover all of them. There's a way to calculate from the shape of the curve, essentially, the unknown diversity. So the estimates were published in a paper in Science, a policy forum in Science. There are other estimates that say there are less viruses out there, and there are other estimates that say there will be more viruses out there. The important point is it's not such a high number that we won't discover them all. We really have two options right now. To a decision tree of fork in the road. We can either go out there and find these viruses and understand them and understand the risk and who's going to get infected first and try and stop emergence, or we can discover them the hard way, which is continue business as usual, and we'll get more and more epidemic diseases and pandemics, and we'll discover them when they infect us and cause pandemics. I don't think that's a sustainable approach. So the point is, this is a tenable volume of discovery to do, and we'll give a good return on investment to do that work. And over to Thijs to talk about the wildlife trade and in particular the exotic pet trade.
So thank you for your question. Indeed, wildlife trade is a very broad concept, and it also includes trading wildlife as pets. And especially in North America and the European Union, these are very big drivers of this type of wildlife trade because they are in high demand in these parts of the world. And for example, there is there has been an outbreak of monkeypox in North America that was emerged as a result of importing exotic rodents from Africa into the United States. And at the centers where these exotic pets are traded, there was a spread of the virus to other species occurring endemically in the United States. And as a result, several dozen people became infected with this monkeypox virus that luckily did not cause any mortality, but it does show very clearly the risk of this large volume and long distance trade in exotic species. Not only a risk for pandemics, but also a risk for species extinction. And in this way, the possibility to reduce these risks works both ways, both for human health and for improving nature conservation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Thijs. We're going to turn to a question now from Tin Lei Win from the Thomson Reuters Foundation, who asks, you've talked about how the virus has badly affected indigenous communities, but do they also have a role in preventing future pandemics, and what would that role be? So that would be one question about indigenous and local communities. And then a second question, Peter, could you elaborate on the point from the report that says, where there is a clear link to high pandemic risk, consideration of taxes or levies on meat consumption, production, livestock production, or other forms of consumption as proposed previously by a range of scientific organizations and reports. So a question about the role of indigenous and local communities and a question about the issue of meat taxation possibilities. Over to you, Peter.
All right, so I'm going to hand over to Carlos Zambrano Torello on the indigenous peoples question. But first, I want to talk about this idea of a livestock levy or a meat tax as it's been proposed. We know this is controversial. There was a Lancet Commission on Food that came out with some pretty striking recommendations on overconsumption of meat. It's bad for our health. We know that, and it's unsustainable actually in terms of environmental impact. It's also a driver of pandemic risk. Outbreaks of influenza virus, new pandemic strains emerge largely because of the interaction of humans and poultry and this incredibly dense production of poultry and pigs in some parts of the world, driven by our global consumption patterns. So we looked into this and thought, well, what has been said in the scientific literature about this, and it's strongly supported, and what's been talked about as a strategy to deal with it. The livestock industry is huge and growing and globalized. And very profitable. Couldn't there be a levy on that production that helps prevent pandemics and does things in a more sustainable way? Could that be then used to provide incentives for producers to be more sustainable individually and make the trade more sustainable? So we've essentially taken those recommendations from various reports and said that this is a viable strategy and should be looked at by governments and by intergovernmental organizations as a way forwards. I do think, there are parallels with climate change for pandemic risk. It's increasing over time, just like carbon dioxide production. And the true way to deal with both are to reduce the consumption patterns that drive them. To do that, we're going to need this transformative change. We're going to change our lifestyles a bit to deal with that. We can continue to eat meat, but we need to do it in a way that is far more sustainable if we want to get rid of pandemics, and we're going to have to pay the price for that. And I think that there's a new generation out there who are willing to make those personal decisions that will lead to a more sustainable lifestyle. And we're hoping that that's going to save our planet in terms of biodiversity loss, climate change, and pandemic risk. So over to you, Carlos, to talk about the other aspects of those questions.
Thank you, Peter. Thank you for everything. Indigenous communities, they play an important role to prevent pandemics, and from different dimensions. First, indigenous communities have a long relationship with nature, and they know their environment very well. But we can also get therapeutic medicine, preventive medicine from these communities. They have been in relationship with nature. They've been collecting. They have this knowledge that can be used to prevent, or more than prevent, to mitigate the effects of diseases. And that's what's been happening. For example, in South America, over the past few months, indigenous communities have been go back to their knowledge and ancestral knowledge, and they start using traditional medicine to alleviate the problem with COVID-19. On the biggest scale, indigenous communities traditionally have low density of people, and they have a certain knowledge on how to integrate or how to manage wildlife. They hunt wildlife, but they don't hunt every day. They don't hunt along the year. So they have knowledge on when's a good moment to hunt wildlife. But also not just that, they have knowledge on how to prepare the food, or which animals to hunt and which animals do not hunt. So they have, and they incorporate that in their culture, and that supporting that kind of information or getting that information from them, it definitely will help to support or to prevent pandemics. Finally, the land tenure, it's a very important issue in the regions. Many indigenous communities, they don't have the rights, they don't have the ownership of their own land, they don't have how to manage their own land. So improving land tenure definitely will support these prevention pandemics. Deforestation will stop in these areas. There won't be any expansion of agricultural areas into indigenous communities. So that will alleviate, that will prevent the emergence of infection diseases.
Thank you very much, Peter and Carlos. We've had a number of questions, both from journalists and from the live feed on YouTube, around the idea of this high-level intergovernmental panel on pandemic prevention, and a number of questions about would this not replicate the work of existing organizations such as the WHO, for instance. Peter, would you like to take that question?
Well, I'm going to start off, but then I'm going to hand over to Carlos Dashneves, who is a strong proponent of this approach. So first of all, yeah, on the issue of whether the World Health Organization does it, you know, there's a lot of misunderstanding about the role of WHO. WHO is a national country member organization that deals with health issues and gets ready for disease risks. It's not an organization that has the funding or the mandate to investigate outbreaks just of its own accord, or to go out there and prevent outbreaks in the future. WHO has put forward some really significant changes over the last few years, including the IHL, the International Health Regulations, that help build capacity around the world and to prevent pandemics. But what we're talking about is something broader than that brings in the environment and ecology sector into health, because that's the essence of this report. So I'm going to hand over to Carlos Dashneves, who was one of the key proponents in our workshop of this approach and strongly supports it. So over to you, Carlos.
Thank you very much, Peter, and thank you for your question. I suppose it's important to realize that pandemics, and the report shows that very clear, are complex topics in the interface between different disciplines. It's relevant for humans, it's relevant for animals, for foods, for the environment. And therefore, it's definitely relevant for a lot of international organizations. And the report recognizes that a lot of these organizations understand this and try to do their best. And there are, through the report, other proposals on how to strengthen these mechanisms. But the fact is that perhaps more in peacetime than in, I'd say, in wartime, like we are right now with COVID, a problem that depends on the interface between topics is also in the interface between organizations. And the fact is, WHO, when COVID is gone, we'll have other problems to focus. We'll have other diseases to fight, to eradicate. And the same will be for FAO and many other agencies. So to make a parallel, I would perhaps highlight climate and biodiversity. There's no doubt that these topics are relevant for all agencies, WHO included. But we all recognize today that stable structures providing knowledge, analyzing data, and providing advice, like the IPCC or IPBES for that matter, have been an amazing driver, an engine to promote action for climate change and action to protect biodiversity. So what we're putting on the table is, in addition to the efforts that these organizations do, especially in crisis times, should we have a stable group, a stable structure that will continuously look into the data, analyze it, connect it, and provide the best early advice to governments and to agencies so that they can act. So I wouldn't say that we are overlapping with what is already there. We're trying to make actually sure that what is there can deliver even better, especially before we are hit again by something like now, because I guess we can say we can't afford it. And we can't allow it to be back at this in 2 or 3 years. Thank you.
Thank you, Carlos, and thank you, Peter. We turn now to a couple of questions posed both by Catherine Early from China Dialogue and a similar question from Thomas Krimenacker from Riff Reporter. Essentially, the question is, do you think that the COP15 process, that's the Conference of the Parties 15 of the Convention on Biological Diversity, should be doing more to embed the prevention of future pandemics in the post-2020 biodiversity framework that's being negotiated? Peter.
Well, thanks for that question. And, you know, I'm going to hand over to Benjamin Roche in a second, but just a quick comment. The COP15, I believe, is scheduled to be held in Kunming in China. And I just think that is an extremely timely and perfect location. We know that some of the bats that carry SARS-related coronaviruses are found in South China, and it's a landscape that is changing, and it gives you a view of some of the issues we need to be dealing with. And the COP15 is just one of the many groups that needs to, or many outlets that needs to take on board this issue. And IPBES is going to be strongly involved in that, as are other organizations, the CBD, etc., who are already looking into this and have mechanisms. In the report, we propose bridging mechanisms between agencies and ways for them to come together and represent all these different aspects of the problem, this complex problem. So David, Benjamin Roche, over to you to comment a little bit on what needs to be done around the biodiversity side, which COP is dealing with.
Sorry, Peter, if I could just interrupt. Sorry, Benjamin, just to hold you for a second and just also ask, because I think, Peter, you raised some very good points about the interaction between the different organizations. So before we go to Benjamin, I'd like to ask Anne, the Executive Secretary of IPBES, to make a couple of comments about the relationship between the findings of a report like this and some of the other intergovernmental processes that are underway. Anne, you have the floor.
Okay, thank you, Rob. So perhaps just to flag the fact that COP15 next year is going to approve an important new framework for biodiversity post-2020. It is going also to acknowledge the fact that we will have this year missed all of our 20 targets on biodiversity. But if you look at the project that is on the table, and if you in particular look at the knowledge that is informing it, you will see that this One Health approach is already included in it, and so that there is already an awareness of the COP15 process, if you will, about these issues of the important linkages between biodiversity and pandemics. There was recently a report that was released by the Secretariat of the Convention on Biological Diversity called the Global Biodiversity Outlook 5, which in fact is very strongly based on the IPBES global assessment and complemented by an analysis of the reports, the national reports provided by governments to the Secretariat of the Convention. And that document talks about transitions to sustainable pathways in order to get out of missing these targets and to start improving how we manage nature better. And among these 8 pathways, there is one that is called One Health, and it does talk about all of these issues that we're talking about here. So the report that we're releasing today, and also the assessment that it would contribute to, this Nexus assessment that I mentioned, then would further inform the implementation of that new framework, which is going to be approved and which will hopefully include this One Health. So then the responsibility of IPBES would then be moving forward to really inform how to concretely translate that framework into action.
Thanks very much. And Benjamin, would you like to add anything on this issue?
Yes, something quite short. So thanks, Peter and Anne, and for the question. So definitely, I think there are a lot of different organizations that works on this issue of biodiversity alteration. So definitely, it looks like all this organization needs to work towards the same goal, which is biodiversity protection. Nevertheless, it's quite clear today that in the pursuit of this goal to protect biodiversity, we know that biodiversity has a lot of impacts on human well-being and especially human health. And definitely, so far, the impact of biodiversity on pathogen emergence for outbreaks from pandemics has not been taken, has not been considered enough from the biodiversity community. So I think that COVID-19 crisis today is showing the importance of considering this dimension of the microbial biodiversity when we consider the biodiversity threats on a broad scale. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Benjamin. We've had a couple of comments and questions from the very active crossover community on biodiversity and climate change. So I'm going to ask a question that was posed by Beth Walker from the Third Pole. Have experts mapped geographic hotspots? I guess this means geographic hotspots for risk, for pandemic risk. And can you say more about the existing evidence of climate change as a driver of pandemics? Peter.
Thank you very much. And I'm going to just talk about briefly on the climate change side, and then I'm going to hand to David Heyman, who is actually publishing a paper. It's going through the press right now on the underlying environmental conditions behind COVID, and knows quite a lot about hotspots of emerging diseases. Look, the climate change understanding, I should say, in a big sense, the origins of pandemics and what drives them is not easy. These are global environmental changes that are happening on the order of decades. They're gradually increasing, and they're reaching thresholds at which pathogens are continuing to move from wildlife, livestock into people. We have small clusters of outbreaks all the time happening all around the world that never get identified, that we know about later when we go and look in archival specimens. And eventually, thresholds are reached at which you get a pandemic. The problem with climate change is that when you look into the science, we're in the process of getting the pandemics that climate change is driving. And we're in the process of understanding that climate change is causing them. There are certainly clear and strong evidence that climate change has caused a shift in vector-borne diseases in Europe, for instance. Tick-borne encephalitis in Northern Europe has moved further and further north with climate warming. A livestock disease caused by biting flies, blue tongue of sheep, seems to have reached Europe. The correct fly to spread that disease, and the virus reached Europe and then spread north because of climate change. But this is the elephant in the room, that the future impacts of climate change on emerging diseases is likely to be very significant. Not just vector-borne or waterborne diseases, which seem obvious from climate point of view, but also climate change will cause shifts in the geographic range of different species and livestock and people. We're going to see migration already due to climate stresses, and that will spread diseases more effectively. So this is one to pay particular attention to for the future, and a huge concern. And now I'm going to hand over to David Heyman on the issues of can we identify the geographic regions, the hotspots from which diseases emerge? David.
Yeah, thank you very much. So there has been some work actually done by Peter and Kate Jones and others some time ago, where they looked at hotspots of different types of infections that might emerge from wildlife and from other things, so including vector-borne diseases like Peter just spoke about. The analysis that we've done so far, so both at the global scale like that, and also we've done some work, say, in sub-Saharan Africa, and we've got this work that's in peer review now in Asia and around China. That work that we've done, it shows that there are hotspots, and those hotspots are these areas where there's that intersection of high biodiversity, high human population growth, and sometimes high livestock presence, high livestock density. And so we are using new tools, new analyses to try to identify where the locations are, but also not just where those locations are, what might tip them to becoming more likely to be hotspots. And that's the important thing, and that's where there's potentially hope as well in ways to mitigate this, because we can see these edge effects and what we're doing that is increasing our risk in some areas. And that's one of the things that comes out of this report, that there's some things that we're doing, like intensification of agriculture, increasing human density, and fragmentation of the natural environment, that is increasing our risks, and we're really getting a good understanding of that, and some of that's covered in the report. Thanks.
Thank you very much, David. Thank you, Peter. One of the things that's remarkable about the intersection of interests in this particular issue is the number of different sectors of journalists and general people who are asking questions. We have a large number of questions coming in. I would urge you, if you are a member of the media, to please identify which outlet you're from so we can prioritize your questions. I'm going to combine a couple of questions which deal with business-related questions, particularly phrased by Chai Chin from Eco Business, and also from, amongst others, Tesh Gardia Lara, a climate reporter from Argentina. What are some of the ways to bring, how do we get, I'm sorry, also Elizabeth Fogg from Colombia, how do we convince people in industry and business to change a business as usual way of life? A similar type of question, how do we incorporate pandemic cost into consumption and production considerations? And similarly, how do you expect that this report can have a real impact on decision makers, given how much of a focus at the moment is being on, for instance, the promotion of activities and incentives for fossil fuels? That's kind of a secondary question. So let's stick with the business question, first of all, and the broader question about incorporation of costs. Peter.
Okay, I'm going to, in a second, hand over to Carlos Zambrano Torrelio on this issue. He's been doing some work on land use change and the accounting of profit and loss around emerging diseases. But look, the businesses, global for-profit companies care about what we, the public, think about them. There is a huge industry and an effort around corporate social responsibility. They respond when people call them out and name them as a company that pollutes or that somehow degrades the environment or does things in an unsustainable way. In Europe, there's been a strong push around palm oil production and the products associated with that that's driven shifts in the way companies do business around palm oil and land use change that is linked to disease emergence. So we have a role to play, all of us, in our consumption, our activism, and our voices around this issue. And companies will listen. And they work with scientists and they want to do a better job. And there's a real opportunity for change. Carlos Zambrano, can you mention some of the work around land use change that you've been doing that sort of shows that?
Thank you, Peter. Thank you for the question. It's important to acknowledge the importance of the private sector into these issues. We all are in the same boat and we all need to work together. Land use change and deforestation in particular is a result of the demand of meat, the demand of crops, the demand of food of humanity. So what we need to do is we need to find a balance in production and demand. And that's what we've been doing work on that. So it's more on the economics of land use change, on the economics of disease emergence. So evidence suggests that deforestation increases the likelihood of emerging infectious diseases, but for example, increases malaria in some places. But we also get benefits from the forest, not just from production of meat or production of crops or food, but also we get benefits from ecosystem services or other services that the nature provides, like clean water or carbon sequestration, for example. But what we are proposing is that the forest can also provide a service, which is the maintenance of human health. So that way we can value the forest from an economic perspective, and we can talk with the industries and say, like, hey, you can develop some land, you can do some development to produce meat, to produce food for the global demand, but do it in this way or do it in this amount that it's not going to exceed or it's not going to become a risk to humanity. At the same time, well, private industry will be making profits, but at the same time we'll be reducing the risk by reducing less or by doing less deforestation. But also we will be preserving some forest. So by doing that, we can talk with the private sector, and we can also include land use planning. We need to start thinking for the next 10 years, the next 20 years, what will happen in our world in 2050.
Sorry, Carlos, I'm going to have to ask you to wrap this question up because we're running really short on time. And
yeah, sure. No, that was all. I was just finishing
okay,
that we should be thinking about the future. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Carlos. Ladies and gentlemen, we're very much approaching the limit of our 1 hour. I would like to ask at least one question or two from the YouTube audience who's also been with us, with the indulgence of our media colleagues as well. A question from Ricardo Ojeda. How would you approach, or could you mention 2 or 3 key take-home messages about dealing with wildlife trade at global and local scales? And a second question, and perhaps this one, the first question to Peter could decide, and perhaps Anne, you could perhaps take a question. Getting information to the public in an easily digestible form is crucial, whether on climate change or pandemics. Who's responsible for that, and is it already happening? Perhaps you could take that question, and Peter, you could take the question for us about take-home messages on the wildlife trade, please.
Anne.
Shall I go ahead first?
Yes, I think Peter's suggesting you should answer first.
I'm sorry, yes. So getting information to the public. So one of the purposes of what IPBES has been doing is to produce reports like the global assessment, which come up with a number of options for action that relate to all stakeholders, including individuals. And we've been presenting conclusions of these reports around the world. And they are first and foremost to inform governments which request these reports, but they also inform the public, and they have had an impact on public awareness and also on public action. As a result of the IPBES assessment, we have seen, for example, cities coming up with biodiversity plans, but we've also seen citizens taking action regarding their individual actions on biodiversity. And so it's a proof that science and knowledge can really trigger action at all levels, including with the general public.
Thank you very much. And Peter.
Quick comment from me, then, and then another from Thies. First of all, there is a huge momentum around the issue of the wildlife trade. Clearly, there was involvement of the wildlife markets in China in the emergence and early spread of COVID, without a doubt. Whether it was a direct product of that market or we don't know. China has called for a ban on the wildlife trade. Some groups have called for a selective ban on different groups of animals, or at least to reassess what we're doing. And look, these are difficult decisions to make. People's livelihoods are at risk. People's nutritional dependency on wildlife in some parts of the world needs to be considered. So Thies, explain how we dealt with that very sensitive and difficult issue on the balance of bans versus other opportunities for the wildlife trade.
Yeah, thanks for that question, Peter. Indeed, it is a difficult balance to take. In the first place, we have to realize that there are many indigenous peoples and local communities that are depending on wildlife for food and for their income. And we have to balance this against the fact that this rapidly increasing wildlife trade also has big impacts, both on pandemic risk, but also on biodiversity loss. So there have been calls, for example, for banning wildlife trade completely, but there are concerns there that this will only drive legal wildlife trade underground and remain there. And if we don't change the way that human society demand for wildlife is, then we can't change the system. So this also is this transformative change. And at the level of the general public, I think it's important for people to really be well educated about the origins of pandemics, including the role that wildlife trade plays in this. They can be aware that some of the things that they consume involve wildlife trade. For example, fur on the edge of coats come from farmed wildlife. And they can also be aware that the diets that they eat also can have an impact on pandemic risk. So changing your diet so that you have a sensible consumption of meat is really important for reducing the risk of pandemics and for conserving biodiversity and nature. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Thies. Ladies and gentlemen, we have so many great questions that are remaining unanswered on this virtual conference. I think this subject matter is so complex and of such great importance and relevance at the moment. That's not surprising, but we have reached essentially the end of the hour that was allocated for this virtual media conference. Just before we end, I would like to make just a few comments about media interviews. If you would like to schedule an interview with any one of our panelists or any of the authors of the report, please send an email to media@ipbes.net, media@ipbes.net. All of the other authors of the report will also be taking interview requests as well. And with that said, I would like to thank everybody who's participated in this call, especially the fantastic authors and panelists, members of the media who've taken the time during a very busy media cycle to join this conference. And just a comment to everybody who joined also through the YouTube link, thank you so much for joining us. Please do remember, post about this report on social media using #pandemicsreport. And with that, this concludes this virtual event. I'd like to thank everybody and wish you to stay healthy and say a very goodbye from IPBES and all of our panelists. Thank you all. Bye-bye.
Bye, everyone.